Good evening, everybody. Thank you for turning up. And first of all, just in case there's a few typos on the slides, I apologise for that. I was just finishing them off at the local primary school. Just sat outside after driving up this afternoon. I think, first of all, it's important to say, I think that the solution to this problem lies in this room, and this solution lies with the community engaging in the process that goes forward. I'll come back to this at the end, but I think it's now's the time not really to look back in so many ways, obviously to look at the errors and maybe some of the issues, but we have to look forward to what the solution is, because looking back is not going to give us the solution. One other thought that I had that I think we should bear in mind when we look at the situation in Boolaroo versus elsewhere in New South Wales, and it's something that's come to my mind recently, is the soil concentrations that we may find in the inner west of Sydney. Some of those soil concentrations are higher than what we found in our sampling in Boolaroo, and that creates a very difficult situation with respect to dealing with the problem. The only difference is in Sydney is that there were a multitude of sources, petroleum companies. People chose to buy that petrol, drive the vehicles around and emit those particulates into the atmosphere. At Boolaroo, we know that there was a single source and a single polluter, and that makes the situation a little bit different. But it'd be useful to bear in your mind that there is this conflict between soil concentrations that we find in Sydney versus what we might find in Boolaroo, for example. And that in itself presents a challenge. So if we abate here, do we abate everywhere else? So, on the first slide, just go to the first one. Yeah, we were asked by the Newcastle Herald, and I've been talking to Matthew Kelly for over a year about doing this work, and I purposely kept out of doing any work in Boolaroo because I knew other people were working here. I spent the time doing work at Port Pirie and at Mount Isa, which resulted in me having a reduced Christmas card list. So we were asked to come up and evaluate the lead abatement scheme, and I knew very little about it, and I deliberately took that role until we started working here last September. And so it's probably worthwhile me saying that we received no funding other than paying for analytical costs. Myself and my students, we did the work pro bono. There was no money for travel or anything like that. And the objective of the study essentially was to assess whether the lead abatement scheme had worked. And we finished our study, we've written it up, and we've submitted it now to the Journal of Environmental Management, and that'll be made available when it comes out after it's been reviewed. But I'm going to give you some of the results tonight. A potted summary. So the primary stated objective of the LAS was to achieve a reduction in human exposure to lead dust contamination in surface soils. That was the primary objective. And so when we've looked at our findings, we've tried to bear that in mind to try and decide, has that objective been achieved or not? And there are various ways that you can examine that. Is it an absolute reduction, i.e. has the total number of lead in the soil been reduced pre and post abatement? Or is it a relative reduction, i.e. has the lead in the soil been reduced relative to guideline standards, for example? So let's have a look at some of the results. So we undertook sampling of the soils, and in the sampling of our soils we followed the Australian standard, which is called the Guide to Potentially Contaminated Soil and Deposited Dust as a Source of Lead Available to Humans. And that should say Standards Australia afterwards. That standard is the one which I've always used in lead contaminated environments. There are a multitude of soil sampling strategies and standards and approaches that one can take. And there is not actually a definitive scheduled standard for Australia per se. You can pick a different standard for a different type of contaminated land situation. But this one is specifically deemed to be applied to potentially lead contaminated environments. It differs from the Pasminco approach, where they took the top 5 centimetres of soil and they analysed the top 5 centimetres. We just analysed the top 2 centimetres. And in simple terms, why would you look at the top 2 centimetres? Well, that's the part of the soil that you interact with, that kiddies would dig in, push their little dozers through, that you would trample into the house on your shoes, and that would generate dust into the garden. The deeper soils tend not to do that, unless of course you're rotivating your garden, for example. We sampled from a range of places. We sampled residential properties, we sampled open spaces, sports fields and playgrounds. We had a total of 69 soils. Some of those soils we analysed also for different grain sizes. We had 17 vacuum dust samples from people's houses. And then we did additional tests on bioavailability. The study is limited in terms of the number of samples, and that's limited by virtue of the cost. It costs about $50 a sample to get it analysed. And we had our work analysed at the National Measurement Institute, which is an accredited laboratory for this sort of work. But of course, more samples, more confidence in the numbers, and that always helps. But we feel that the samples that we took are sufficient for us to draw, at least you would say, some preliminary conclusions. I think the conclusions we can draw on the findings themselves are concrete because the data itself is good. The next slide, thanks. So in terms of the results summary, what we found was, in terms of the residential properties, there was no statistical difference between front and back. There was no difference in between houses that were abated versus those that weren't abated. So we had some knowledge after we did our sampling, which houses had been abated and which houses hadn't. We deliberately asked not to know that before we started. I'll come on to the numbers in a minute for those residential properties. Open space had a mean concentration of about just under 800 milligrams per kilogram. And what you need to bear in mind is that the Australian standard is 600 for open space. Sports fields would be a similar number, 600. The mean was 5,000, just over 5,000. But that number is highly skewed by some lead slag that was sampled, which was 17,500 on one of the sports fields. And then the schools and the playgrounds, they had a mean concentration, again, of just about 800. Quite a big range, as you can see there. Just go on to the next slide. I think the main message to take from this slide is not to spend your time looking at all the various graphs and the details, but what we've got on these graphs are different metals plotted against each other. So it's looking at the association, for example, up on the top right, we've got total soil lead concentration on the x-axis, on the bottom axis, and on the vertical axis we've got the total zinc concentration. And we can see the metals, the concentrations in the metals are highly correlated. The same thing relates to lead and cadmium on the bottom right, and on the bottom left, the same thing relates to lead and antimony. And what this tells us is that there was a common source of emissions. Often in a contaminated environment, there's several favoured lines that are used by people who don't want to accept the fact that there's been pollution from a smelter. I don't think anybody's denying it here. But there's never been one study that's shown that a smelter or a mine hasn't impacted the adjoining environment. But one of the favourite lines is naturally occurring. That's the first line, which we know that's not the case here. The second line would be, oh well, if it's an ongoing facility, it's all legacy emissions. You know, that's there's nothing to do with contemporary emissions, it's all to do with previous emissions. And a classic third one would be, is lead paint. Lead paint's the problem, and you know, it's nothing to do with the smelter. But 9 times out of 10, it usually is the obvious. That's the usual answer. And I think that's fairly clear in here that the smelter has been, if you look at all the historical data as well, it's quite clear about the extent of the emissions to the atmosphere. And those emissions produce particulates which accumulated in the soils that we sampled. On the top left here, we've got the vacuum bag analysis. And what we have got on the bottom axis, the x-axis, we've got the total concentration in the vacuum bags. And in the y-axis, the vertical axis, we've got the bioavailability of that lead in the vacuum bag samples. And that was about 90% bioavailable. And that's quite high. And that tells you that the lead that you find in and around people's homes in dusts is quite accessible. And you can see the range there from sort of just below 200 milligrams per kilogram, the total concentration in the dust, up to nearly 1,400 milligrams per kilogram. Next slide, please. So we also were able to do, and we only got some information very recently about the pre-abatement tests that were undertaken by Pasminco when they did some soil analysis on the houses. I don't want to get into the technical discussion of that, it's just not appropriate at this point. We only have a very limited number of samples, and so when you look at the data, you've got to bear in mind that there are a limited number of data points, but the data points that we've got there themselves are reliable. So there's 8 houses that we're able to look at, soil front and soil back, and compare them to the samples that we took from our study last September. Can we have the next? So this is the LAS, the lead abatement strategy, and MQU is Macquarie University sampling. And the LAS is in blue in every slide, and Macquarie University sampling is in red. And what we've got here, we're looking at soil front samples. So the 8 houses are on the bottom, and the concentration of lead in the soil is on the vertical axis. And what you can see there is, and in the top right, I've just really given you the mean number, so you can see the difference between the two. The LAS mean was 953, and the Macquarie University mean was 989. Now, what you have to remember, and most people often forget this, if you take a soil sample, it's a unique sample. You can never take that soil sample again, because it's not repeatable. So each time you take a soil sample, it in effect is a new sample. And that has itself some inherent problems in terms of replication of study. The sampling depths were slightly different between the 2 studies, so that's another factor that comes into play. But bearing all those limitations in mind, you've got to think, has the programme achieved its objective to reduce the amount of lead dust available in the soils? So that's, next slide. And then the same slide for the backyards, same colour scheme. The mean numbers are on the right-hand side. The LAS showed that there was 926, this is before they did abatement, and Macquarie University sampling showed that there was 1240 milligrams per kilogram in the soil afterwards. And I do believe there's another one like this. And then we just did an average of all of the soils that were collected in the yards, and we looked at the mean values for all of the values. And what you can see there is a similar sort of pattern. The LAS is 940, Macquarie University sampling is just over 1100. And I think what you can draw from that, there is no statistical difference between the pre and post abatement numbers. And that is the same as what we found when we looked at the houses, between the houses that had been abated and the houses that hadn't been abated. So let's have a look at the next slide. So in terms of previous knowledge, I might have to drop the slide. Oh, no. Did the LAS achieve a reduction on human exposure to lead dust contamination in surface soils? In short, in summary, based upon the data that we've looked at, the only conclusion we can come to reasonably is no, it hasn't done that. There is no evidence to suggest that it has done that. Now, I preface that with saying that there will be some blood lead studies that will be undertaken, and that will have a look to see if there's any transference of any lead dust generated from those soils into people as we move forward. And then the second question that I actually wanted to look at, and we considered in our paper, was it best practice at the time? And I think we've done a brief look at some of these sites and what has been undertaken at these different sites at Bunker Hill, Hayden, Winkleman, Tacoma, Esperance in Western Australia, New Orleans, Baltimore, Los Angeles, the Maffra State, and the one at Los Angeles has just happened, literally within the last couple of months. And the simple answer is, what the lead abatement strategy would not stack up against these other practices. It is markedly different, and these other practices have deeper soil removal, more transparent process. For example, at Tacoma in Washington, you can get on the web, you can pull up a map, and you can click on a property and you can look at the pre-abatement numbers on the houses, and then you can go through the document, and then you can look at the post-abatement numbers. And we're talking there, these are hundreds of milligrams per kilogram different. So you can actually see, as a resident, what these different houses look like and the effectiveness of the abatement strategy. So some of these other places, most of these other places are post-abatement assessments. As far as I know, and I haven't had it corrected, that the work that we've done, even though it's only a small number of samples, is the only information that is available and has been presented to the public about post-abatement, and I think that's a rather unfortunate mistake. That's not really cast a good light on the whole process. In addition, elsewhere there were better clean-up standards. That means the concentrations of allowable or permissible arsenic or copper or lead or zinc or whatever element it had to be were better, i.e. were lower than what we used in the whole list of sampling action levels that we used in the lead abatement strategy. Next. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about, I think there's lost some slides somewhere, that's a bit odd. Does that just go back one? Okay, go forward. I think something's happened to one of the slides. So I'm just going to show some slides that Tony Morrison gave me this afternoon. I did ask Tony to give me one slide, but he gave me 4. So when you see him next time, you can talk about that. So this is Tony doing his work. Tony is a senior student, as it were, but he's also working as a research assistant at Macquarie University, and he's hopefully finally going to finish his PhD, which is based upon the slag deposits in and around Lake Macquarie. And he's been publishing on this now for over a decade. So I'll try and summarise some of his work for you. Next slide. The slag studies to present. Well, he's looked at the bioaccessibility of metals in the slag fractions, and he's been doing this now for over a decade. He published work in 2007, and most people will have seen that. You can find it on the Science of the Total Environment website, I do believe. He's also looked at the morphology of the slag to try and understand what that might mean in terms of the release of metals. Then he's looked at the accessibility of those metals in the slag to fluids that may impact the slag, i.e. different concentrations of water in terms of acidity, different acidity of water. Then he's looked at, recently he's finished his study and he's reported the results to council. They've only just received that report, and therefore they're considering the findings of that report, and he will then make some amendments, and that report will then, as I understand it, be made available to the expert working group so they can consider that in their deliberations about what to do next and why to do it. So Tony's work, where to from here? Well, what he's done is he's finishing his work looking at slag samples from 3 specific locations. He's taken samples at different depths, very small depths, 100 millimetres. He's done lots of replicates, and he's looked at the chemistry and the size implications of the leachability of that slag. And then he's undertaken what's called sequential leaching, and that basically means is subject the slag to different strengths of acid in order to see how easily leachable the metals are in that in the slag. And so he's taken a 7-part leach study, and he's just listed there 1 to 7 easily mobile heavy metals, easily dissolved heavy metals, those down to manganese oxide, those down to organic compounds, down to number 5, down to poorly crystalline iron oxides, and so we go through down to residual heavy metals, which you can extract using hydrofluoric acid, which are not really accessible to the human body. So 500 leachate analyses. The result of that work will enable a more coherent model of leaching behaviour of the slag that rests in and around Lake Macquarie for the different metal species that are found in that slag, which takes into account the range of morphology and accessibility. He thinks that the work will help guide the development of a model for remediation, which takes into account the properties of real rather than the mythical material. And he's rung me up several times and has impressed upon me that that really the lead slag is bioavailable, despite the story or the myth, as he calls it, that's been propagated, that the lead in the slag has been bound up and is not bioavailable. Indeed, I had a slide in there, it seems to have disappeared in my saving it to a PDF. The slide basically talked about Graham Batley's report in June 1992, which basically identified that the lead slag was bioavailable, and subsequent to that in July 1992, the council was quoting from a Pasminco newsletter which said the slag was not readily available, i.e. bioavailable, and that in any case, that lead slag should be covered with at least 30 centimetres of clean film if it was to be used in and around yards. So look, that's a very quick, brief summary, because it's 7:50 or whatever it is now. And just in terms of moving forward, I've just thought of a few points that I thought might be quite helpful for us to think about as a community, both as scientists, regulators, and the public. I think we need to accept the errors of the past and seek a long-term workable solution. Harpooning the current government or the people in charge now, that might feel good at the time, but it's not going to give us the solution that we need. We need a solution to this problem. So that's why I said at the start, I think it's really important to remember that the solution to the problem lies in this community. It's in terms of the engagement. The New South Wales government has committed to a blood lead survey. I think it's really important that the community engages in that survey, because without that data, nothing is going to happen. If there's no data, nothing will move forward. And my experience of working either as a commissioner in the court or as an expert or an advisor to government or companies is they only do anything when there's real data. You have to produce the data. And that's why they've restarted this blood lead program. I think one of the challenges of a blood lead program is a point-in-time study, and blood lead is really good. There's debate around that for about 30 days, so it gives you an image of what's happened in the recent period to a child. It doesn't give you a measure of the long-term exposure. And just because we have a situation where the blood lead levels are negligible, that doesn't mean to say that the lead in the soil does not present a harm to the future. I think that's one thing that needs to be borne in mind, that we need to make sure that there's no long-term risk of exposure by what's left and what we do next. The New South Wales government has also committed to forming an expert working group, which they invited me to be part of, and is seeking community engagement. To some, I have heard, and I understand it's not constituted to them, it's not a perfect situation, but the community now has the government's attention, which it didn't have for a long time. And so using that opportunity wisely would really help us seek a resolution for all and for the long term. So what I'm saying is, it's not often that you get the government's attention, that they genuinely engage, as they have done recently at Broken Hill. So my advice on that is, let the process take its course, engage in it, and let's see what unfolds. Be part of it, try and make the outcomes as good as possible. I think overall, I would like to finish by saying the community is in a much better situation with respect to dealing with the contamination and maybe questioning the process that has gone ahead than what it was pre-October 2014. And I think, as I see it now from my perspective, everything is moving forward in the right direction. And I think that's a good situation and a good platform for when the community can see the outcomes that it wants. And that the outcomes that it wants hopefully will come through the community engagement that the New South Wales government has offered. I think that's it.